Seth's latest graphic novel, Clyde Fans, is an immersive and epic exploration of the sense and meaning of life. Every life, even when it's not apparent on the surface. This week, Kumar and Dana discuss the new book. First, I'd like to thank our patrons for helping to keep the show going. You can pitch in by pledging at least $2 a month at patreon.com/deconcomics.
This is Kumar.
This is Dana.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Kumar in Melbourne. Dana is in Fredericton. I was about to say in Canada, but maybe not for much longer, if certain people have their way.
Yeah, Fredericton, America.
Yeah. Well, we're here to talk about a very Canadian book today.
Yep.
This is Clyde Fans by Seth. I had previously read... The only other full Seth book I've read is It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken, which was his first full-length graphic novel.
Okay. Interesting. For once, you and I are coming at a book with a very similar background.
Okay.
Because that's exactly what I've read of Seth as well.
Right. So he's famous for being old-timey. Like he gets around in a suit and a hat. No matter where he goes or what he does, it seems like he seems to like the way things were in the old days, at least on the surface. That's the image he presents. His cartooning is done in the old-fashioned New Yorker style. And in fact, It's a Good Life was all about, it seemed to be an autobiographical comic about him trying to find out more information about this New Yorker cartoonist, who was very obscure. And, but everybody after reading the book went scrambling to find out more about this cartoonist, and he had just been made up by Seth. It was like a big prank. It was like a hoax almost. Yeah. But he does draw on that style with a very thick line. This book is in a kind of very muted two-color system or something like that, but it's very like subtle.
Yep.
He started serializing this in his series Palookaville in 1997, and it went through to about 2017, so 20 years. In Palookaville, issues 10 through 23. Now, I say issues, but at a certain stage, Palookaville changed format into each issue was a hardcover that was 100 pages. Like a deluxe, shiny, like with like gold foil on the cover. That kind of like very beautiful art objects, so you could hardly call them issues anymore. But anyway, there were partial collections in 2000, 2004... And then in 2019, we got a complete hardcover, which is the one that I sought out and got.
Okay.
And now, for some reason, it's being covered on Canada Reads. Now, this is how it came to your attention. So you need to explain what Canada Reads is, because even I don't follow it or really know what it is.
I don't really know what it is either, but I would say in a nutshell, it's basically it's the Canadian reality TV like Survivor, except for Canadian literature. Okay. So basically, instead of survivors that are thrown on an island for 2 months or whatever, what you have is there's a long list that's put together by whatever committee and organization, and then ultimately a short list, and then the short list of books will be each book will be championed by someone who kind of defends that book and argues for it to be selected as the winner. And much like this kind of traditional survival style reality show, each week one of the books or one of the contestants is voted off the island, so to speak, and at the end there is one winner of Canada Reads. So that's kind of what Canada Reads is. It's an annual thing, and my mother and sister Radio. So
Okay.
CBC,
Okay.
Canadian Broadcast Corporation, Canada's public radio. It actually there might be some of it that's either broadcast on television or maybe on like internet streaming or something. But I think it's primarily through radio, and yeah, so it's something that some people like to follow it and gives them some good ideas of, hey, here's some great Canadian books to read this year.
Right.
And yeah, so that's how I hear about it because my mom and sister are both into this.
Okay, so we were trying to figure out why Clyde Fans was on it, because it's not a new release, I don't think. So, as I said, this hardcover came out in 2019. Maybe the softcover just came out, but we did get these Canadian postage stamps that came out last year that have got, they've got like Chester Brown's Louis Riel on there, and they've got Rabagliati, he's a Quebec cartoonist, and they've got the Tamaki sisters. Yes, it is Tamaki sisters.
Jillian Tamaki and Mariko Tamaki are actually cousins, not sisters. Refer way back to my interview with Jillian in episode 210.
And it's got Seth's Clyde Fans as one of these postage stamps that were released last year. I don't know if they were just like... Are they all supposed to be new releases or on this Canada Reads, or are they...
No, I don't think Canada Reads is necessarily new releases.
So the year Ducks won, it was like a coincidence almost that it had come out that year.
That's right, yeah. Was it 2 years ago that you and I recorded? Something, like 2 years ago we recorded our Ducks episode, and yeah, that was coincidentally, it had come out and was also on Canada Reads that same year. I've got the soft cover of Clyde Fans here, and I've been looking through it, and I can't find anywhere where they've actually got a date. It's just one of those very beautiful artistic style books where it's straight into art right as soon as you open up.
Yeah, I actually had to flip through several, like probably 15 pages, I think, before I got to. There's a dedication page. Oh yeah, where is that? Maybe it's at the back somewhere. I did manage to find it at one stage. Oh yeah, it's at the very back. There's a lot of very small print, which has like other books by Seth and stuff. It's a red page, and it's got 2019 on here.
Okay, yes, there's the publishing. Yeah, so 2021 is the first paperback edition.
Okay.
So, even for paperback, it's not like it was new this year. So 2021.
So I think maybe somebody saw the stamp and they're like, we better put this on the show.
Yeah, could be.
Okay, so this thing is, as we kind of hinted at, is a 500-page giant. It is massive. And it's really ballsy, especially when you consider how much of it is deliberately boring. It's like, whoa, that is a choice to make a book this big and have long passages where you're trying to make sense of things, or to imbue a meaning into things where he's just going off on long lists of stuff. But I think we'll get into all of that as we go through it.
Yeah.
So I don't even know where to start with this thing. It's in 5 sections. Each section is set in a different year. But they're kind of out of order. And overall, it's a story about these two brothers, Abraham Matchcard and Simon Matchcard. And they ran a company called Clyde Fans. Now, when the story, quote-unquote story, starts in 1997, we get Abe waking up with the sunrise, I guess. Yep. And he goes through his day. He puts in his teeth. He makes his meals. He goes for a little walk around. He checks on things. He sits and reads a book, etc., etc. But while he's doing all this stuff, I didn't count the pages. It must be about 100 pages. He narrates out loud. These are spoken word balloons.
Yep.
His life as a salesman and the history of the company, and he starts out by telling this very unfunny salesman joke. You only know it's a joke because he says it's a joke.
Yeah.
And it's funny. I read this twice, and because you end up reading the word balloons, you kind of missed. Like I started reading the word balloons and ignoring what he was doing.
Yeah.
And I would float in and out. Like sometimes I would notice, sometimes I didn't. So the second time through, he was doing stuff that I hadn't noticed he had done the first time. Even actually, I was reading the second time, and I was like flipped back, and I was like, wait, didn't he say something about this before? And I flipped back 10 pages or whatever, and I saw there was a scene where was playing the piano, and this is something I hadn't noticed 2 times through it. And there was lots of stuff like that. It's very hard to get a handle on what Seth is trying to do in this section, but what I found was, especially rereading the book, stuff starts to make sense. And it opens with 10 pages of this house that the brothers lived in, which are completely unoccupied and there's no light. And you're just like, what is this? You're looking at pictures of rooms. You don't know anything. There's no context. You're just looking at pictures of empty rooms, drawings of empty rooms. And you're like, what is this? And you don't know. And in fact, the opening page is those kind of like like before the book even starts, you're getting all these weird images, random, like a man standing next to a giant apple or something, and like these like sketch drawings in a loose leaf notebook, and you're like, what is this stuff? And none of this stuff makes any sense until you get much later into the book, right?
Yeah.
Okay, now did you have a take on this before we go into more details, or try to pry out some details from this?
But my take on it really, it is that this first chapter. I guess, sorry. What Seth, I think, was trying to do, I'm not entirely sure, but I think that it only made sense to me, or my impression came about after reading the second chapter.
Yes.
And so that the first chapter does what it does relative only to the second chapter. So I think it's still a big question mark for me why Seth decided to do this really bizarre first chapter. It doesn't look bizarre, but it is bizarre because, as you described, there's a guy that's going about his entire day.
Yeah, he's about 80 years old.
He's about 80 years old, and simultaneously he's telling the reader directly, speaking to the reader. Well, ostensibly, maybe not necessarily. He could be talking to himself.
This is a big question.
It certainly sounds like he's talking to the leader, or the reader. Sorry. Now, contrast this with Chapter 2, which focuses on Simon, his, I think, younger brother, and is taking place in 1957.
Yeah.
Simon is on his way to embark on a sales trip, basically, for the Clyde Fans company. We get a little bit of flashback and memory that sets up somebody. We probably later can understand that this is Abe telling Simon, "You're not cut out for this. Why do you want to do this?" And Simon is adamant, like, "No, I want to go. I need to do this," or whatever.
Yeah.
But we very quickly see that Simon, unlike his brother in the first chapter, hardly speaks to anyone, let alone constantly nonstop.
He has a kind of crippling introversion.
Yes.
And we get hints of that from Abe's speech in the first chapter, because he talks about how his brother's vocation he should have been a prisoner.
That's
and
right.
He says, "I can't think of anyone less inclined by nature to be a salesman." No, that's not entirely true. I forgot my brother Simon. He says this kind of stuff. And he says, but as you read later on, I don't know if Seth's feelings changed about the characters, but Abe says in the first chapter things like, "Unlike Simon, I never saw this place as a cage." But I don't know that Simon views his house as a cage. We learn gradually that Simon was kind of a shut-in in that house. Not completely. This is all very massive. It's hard to condense all this stuff down. But Abe keeps making, I think, like, statements that indicate that he misunderstood Simon. Simon has passed away by this point. But he says things like, he just wasn't. He says, like, he talks about the house as if it was a prison for Simon, whereas Simon, at least initially, chose to lock himself in the house. And, in fact, we learn later that Abe also did not live in this house initially, but now he himself has chosen to live in this house, which he doesn't tell us in this chapter. And also, the thing you mentioned about him talking to the reader, he never says, "Dear reader," or anything like that. He never looks at the camera. I wondered if this is actually a kind of monologue that is stuck in his head and he goes over again every single day. Over and over again.
Possibly.
And he's been doing it for 20 years. And there's hints later on that, I mean, he does have like some mild OCD behavior with looping stuff in his head. And we definitely know that Simon has this issue and that their mother seriously had a serious dementia issue. So it might be literally him going through this. I don't know that we're supposed to read it that way, but the book certainly invites a possibility.
I think it works that way. I think it works that way, and like so many things in this book, everything seems to work in any way that you want to look at it.
Yes.
Which is really beautiful. But for me, those first two chapters were the characters communicated by the form of the work. So in chapter 1, we have a fourth wall breaking character. As you said, not necessarily have to be interpreted that way. I interpreted it that way. So we have this garrulous, talkative, extroverted Abe match card in chapter 1. And then we have the contrast in chapter 2 with the character doesn't speak to the reader, doesn't hardly speak to anyone in the world. And I guess the form, not the form. I mean, they're both comics, but the way that the comics are written, that we have this extroverted character in chapter 1 and this, as you say, kind of not just painfully introverted, but almost debilitatingly introverted character in the second chapter. So that was kind of how I saw the way that he was writing those characters in terms of how they were speaking / not speaking. That was just a characterization technique. But not just that. I guess I don't want to diminish it to just that. But to me, it hit me really hard. Like,
the complete contrast.
What a brilliant way to contrast these two brothers and two characters. And it really set up for me the rest of the book and these two characters with their opposite kind of personalities.
Yeah, another interesting thing here, too, is that Abe is constantly complaining about Simon's introversion. He doesn't understand it. He doesn't understand why this guy can't form a sentence. In fact, in later chapters, we see Simon even has trouble speaking to his brother. He's always stuttering. But we get his internal thoughts, and they're really quite articulate.
Yeah.
He's thought this through. He knows how empty his life is. It's not like he's oblivious to what he's done. But meanwhile, Abe is like, in this chapter, he goes out on the street, and we get pages of him describing every other shop that's on the street and the histories of all these shops. He talks about this restaurant that he went to for lunch for 30 years. Yep. And it's like, is this really any better off? He's quite hypocritical about Simon. That kind of emerges in bits and pieces.
Yeah.
He reads these. He's obsessed with the radio. He doesn't like TV. He's a real old timer. This guy.
Yeah.
He doesn't even like TV. He likes the radio, and he even reads a radio magazine at one stage. Like,
yeah.
Like, but we learn the little bits we learn. We learn a little bit about Simon, as I mentioned, and how he became a shut-in. I don't think the mother's mentioned even once in this first chapter, which is interesting.
Yeah, she's a very, very minor part, if anything. Yeah.
I don't think we hear anything. Maybe he does say that I never lived here Simon and Mom lived here. I can't remember exactly.
Maybe, yeah.
So I worked out some of the dates. So in 1937 he was 21 years old. So then that's how I worked out that now when it's 1997 he must be about 81. He's been running the company since he was 29. We don't know what happened to the dad at this stage that had founded the company in 37. And we learned that the company closed down in the 70s, and basically they never kept up with the times. He was running the company, but when heating came in and space heaters, he was like not interested. He was just like, no, we're a fans company. And he just, this is his thing. Like, he's constantly complaining about Simon living in the past or whatever, but he just was not able to keep this company going because he wouldn't move with the times. He says in a line of dialogue he was married and divorced. Just one line we get about that.
Yep.
And there's some weird bits in here. Like, I noticed there's a scene where he's straightening a picture on the wall. Yeah. I was like, how could he not have done this in the past 30 years? If he's going through this routine every day. There's an interesting line where he says he thinks Simon must have put himself into every object here. The house is full of... It's not a hoarding situation, but it's full of knickknacks. And he mentions that Simon collected postcards and was corresponding with people, and perhaps it was busy work, is how he describes it.
Yeah.
Which is another... I mean, the postcard thing is much more serious to Simon. To me, it was another indication of, especially on second read, that Abe didn't really understand Simon.
Yeah.
But I think part of the book is that I don't know how much we can understand anybody, but we'll come back around to that as we try to get through it. There's a calendar. I noticed a calendar on the wall. There was a 1978 calendar.
Yeah.
It was still hanging on the wall.
I loved the calendars and the clocks in the first chapter.
Broken clocks. Yeah, that's right. That don't tell the time correctly. Yeah, which he says out loud.
He does say it out loud. Not when they first appear, but like the second or third time you see the clock or the calendar or whatever, he actually mentions it. And I felt that this was kind of Seth's thing again of maybe playing jokes, or I don't think he's overly concerned about telling a fiction or a non-fiction, like a memoir and a fiction. Yeah. Like, those are not necessarily separate things in his mind. And so that was kind of a little tip of the hat from the author saying, yeah, you saw the clock or the calendar or whatever in the background, and you're using that to anchor this scene in time.
Yeah.
And now I'm telling you, oh yeah, that clock is broken and it hasn't told the correct time ever. So when you notice that clock in the background and say, oh, this guy's waking up at 8:30 in the morning, maybe not.
You're right.
So none of the information that you're picking out of this comic is reliable. That's like the comic. That's what it's telling you.
Yes.
But I did also want to comment on that first chapter focusing so much on Abe, and yeah, we do learn that a lot of what he tells us is also unreliable. But the other thing I think that first chapter did for me was it really helped to humanize Abe, because I think if you had the rest of the book without that first chapter being from Abe's point of view, Abe would just be a monster, because he didn't understand Simon, and he didn't treat Simon or his mother very well, because those middle chapters that we get with Simon living with his mother as she declines and he declines, Abe is a monster to them, in a way, or at least not a very good brother.
Yes, but it humanizes him in a way that this is still not the true Abe. This is his narrative about himself. He talks about what a good salesman he was, and all this kind of stuff. None of it's necessarily true. It's just his. It's almost a sales pitch. He's sales pitching himself to us.
Yeah.
He's like, this is how you'd be a good salesman. And I mean, 5 pages into this thing, it really was like Willy Loman, like Death of a Salesman. I was like, this is depressing. Like hearing this guy only talks about selling stuff. He's got no other life, no interests. His only interest maybe the radio. But then there's some signs of awareness. He does mention, that he talks about how the only evidence of himself, since he's locked himself in the house, out in the world, is maybe scraps of paper that are left around of invoices that he's signed where he sold fans, where he's like, there's fragile pieces of paper scattered all over the province. And he says, yellow bits of scrap with my name signed on them. Those fragments prove to the world out there that I once existed. It occurs to me that those papers probably have a more meaningful relationship with the outside world than I do. And we should bear that in mind, too, because the idea of paper comes up again and again. And as with everything in the book, I tried to put the puzzle pieces together, and I don't think that's what you're supposed to do. I think there's like recurring motifs, and I don't think you can necessarily fit these things together. But you just keep coming back to them, and you try to put meaning into them. And this is a thing. We'll get to jump way ahead. There's a 5-page sequence later on where Simon inventories mentally every object in his mother's room after they put her into a home. And it's 24 panels a page, and it's 5 pages. So you're looking at 125 panels of just little objects, perfume bottles, a ukulele they bought in Hawaii maybe, little figurines, all sorts of random shit. And I'm reading this 5 pages going, what is that? Why is this 5 page? Why isn't it just 1 page? And we get the point, but that's not the point. You read it twice through, and you, as a reader, start like, okay, I got to try to make meaning of this. This has to mean something. You're trying to put meaning into that ukulele, or that picture that she kept, or the husband's hat, which they're like, there's no reason that Simon says thinks that there's no reason that should be there, and you're like trying to process all of this and put it all in there. I felt like, they're constantly doing that, and that's what Abe's doing when he's thinking about these pieces of paper. So anytime you see like litter on the street, which is often you see litter floating in, I'm like, okay, this means something. Yeah. I was trying to, and all the stuff that, especially that I thought on the first read, was like, Jesus, why is this scene so boring? Why is he talking about all these restaurants? And the second time through, I'm like, okay, there's got to be a reason. And it's kind of, I guess it's kind of accumulated me. You kind of figure out, when he talks about all the other shops on the street, you're like, okay, this is his life. That's how you understand who he is and what he thinks about all the time. That's how you understand his mind is, oh, this guy thinks about all that time, all the time. That's what his life amounts to, in a sense.
And in the same sense, maybe you understand who the mother was, or maybe Simon understands who the mother was, who his mother was, by inventorying the objects that were in her room. Somehow that paints a picture of that person, however imperfect and incomplete it may be. It is a picture. Yeah. Nonetheless. Yeah.
There's one very specifically which I loved, which is she's kept these 2 paintings of like big-eyed kids. You've seen these. They were paint by numbers pictures. And he's he says, those don't seem like the kind of thing she would be interested in. Yeah. And then a panel later, he says, truth be told, I gave them to her as a present. I'm like, wait a second, you gave them to her and you're wondering why she would be interested in them. So he bought them knowing she wouldn't like them, or he doesn't understand that she might have some sentimental attachment to those pictures because he's the one that gave them to her.
Yeah. Well, those are all possibilities that Seth allows you to entertain.
Yes. In fact, forces you to if you read the book more than once, and you're like, this has got to be something. There's something going on here. There's got to be.
Yeah.
So the 1957 chapter is Simon, who's
or Abe.
No.
Oh, sorry, 57. Sorry.
It's 1957. Right. So this is Abe's, or sorry, Simon's business trip, his sales trip to a town called Dominion in Ontario, which is not a real town, I don't think. I looked it up and couldn't figure it out because there used to be a supermarket chain. And Canada used to be called the Dominion of Canada, which is, I think, where this was derived from. So
no, my understanding is that it's a fictional town created by Seth.
Right. But it's 40 years earlier, so it's 40 years earlier than the introduction.
Yeah.
He seems to be going on this trip to prove to himself that he can do it. Abe thinks it's just a whim, and Abe says selling is serious. It's not something you can just do on a whim. But Simon wants to prove he can do it. He says, tomorrow I will sell. He's trying to prove it to himself as well, not just because he knows what kind of person he is. There's a scene right when he arrives in town, he goes to a restaurant, and he's trying to order from the waitress, and he's sweating. Like he's
having a hard time.
Yeah, he's having a real hard time speaking to this woman. I actually, as much as I really connected with a lot of this book. Going through it, and it seems like this. I actually got it. I got it completely. And his brother's like, call me when you get there. And he doesn't call. He keeps coming up with we don't have a vocalized excuse for why he won't call, but he keeps he looks at the phone booth. He's like, I'll call back later. He says sometimes he does.
Yeah.
But he keeps getting knocked back for whatever reason. I mean, it's excruciating watching him try to sell to people. He walks into the manager's office. The manager's like, I only buy on Fridays. Today's a Tuesday. Come back on Tuesday. He's like, I'm not in town on Tuesday. So he's sweating. Simon walks out. At one point, he goes to this place, and he talks to the receptionist, and the receptionist's like, well, yeah, the boss is in, but I don't think he's going to want to talk to you. So he just turns and walks out. I totally got that. That would be me in any of these situations. I'm like, I'm out of here. I'm not going to try to talk to him anyway, just because, the receptionist said that he probably won't buy from you. There's another one where he goes into this office and he has to wait in the waiting area, and he can hear the boss having a conversation with another salesman, and they're really pals. And they're telling jokes. They're talking about when they're going to get a beer next time. And they're palling around, and Simon is just sweating. There's another salesman waiting there too, and that guy's giving Simon looks like, what's up with this guy? Yeah. And then when it's ready for his turn, he's gone. He's walked out. Like he just can't handle the idea
with that.
Yeah, exactly. This is the first instance where we get Simon's daydreams or fantasies. There's at
the end of the chapter,
well, actually in the middle. So there's a picture of maybe it is near the end, but there's a picture of a lighthouse in his hotel room, and Seth he's a real genius about this because he'll go into an extreme close-up of a lighthouse, say. Because it's comics, it only works in comics. You assume that you've changed scene to an actual lighthouse somewhere. In fact, then when he backs away, we can see that it's a picture of a lighthouse on the wall. Now, that could be a painting, it could be a photograph, we don't know, because it's a comic, but you actually couldn't tell that wasn't part of the scene. Yeah. But it disorients you a little bit. So maybe he goes into it a little bit later. But he goes out into next day. There's a sales room, another salesman in the room next to him at the hotel.
In the hotel, yeah.
This guy's an old hand at this. He knows what he's doing. And in fact, it seems like at the end of it, he manages to sell Simon this really like racist toy, like this piece of junk, which he himself says, why am I selling these awful things? Well, somebody will buy them. And then in the next scene, we see that Simon actually has one of these. So he must have bought it from the guy. And again, I saw myself in this. Like, if some salesman badgered me for an hour about something, I would probably buy the thing just to make him go away. Yeah. Now, another thing that starts happening here with Simon is he starts replaying the conversations that he's had with these salesmen in his head. And he imagines them, but he reimagines them. First, he just recalls what they said, and he's like, and you can see the pain, he's sweating, he remembers that guy said, I don't buy on Fridays, or I only buy on Fridays, or whatever. And then he starts rewriting the conversations as if he came up with the right thing to say at that moment, where he says, well, actually, we have this, you could save money if you buy our fans instead of the person you usually buy from, etc., etc. He's a real smooth talker in his fantasies.
Yep.
Which again I completely related to.
We all do that. Yeah.
And then he starts seeing these lines coming from Abe. Like he says, it's not the person he spoke to, it's Abe, and this whole fantasy is kind of constructing itself as he's trying to get through this. Now, that night, he goes into the lighthouse in his fantasy. He enters that lighthouse. He walks around. He has these weird, I don't know if it's this time or later, he sees birds with human faces. That he has that fantasy twice in the book. We see his mother for the first time, but we don't know who it is. He's just looking in at this old woman sitting in a room.
Yeah.
The next day he walks the streets again. He sees this weird logo on a shop sign that looks like a kind of beehive, and he focuses on it for a second, and then nothing more is made of it. But later on, it occupies one of his fantasies where he's like in a field full of these weird beehives.
Yep.
And again, we're getting into kind of the OCD that's happening in his brain a little bit. Like this image that he saw in 1957 is going to haunt him for 30 years and come up again and again.
Yeah.
He goes into a diner. He hears people having conversations, normal conversations. He's like, I can't handle this. There's a beautiful overhead full-page spread of the city of Dominion. It's like 2 pages, I think, and it's just completely overwhelming. You can totally understand how it's like the whole weight of the city is on top of him. He's completely bedraggled. He walks out of town. He's like, I can't handle it anymore. He goes into this little shop. The shop has these postcards in it, and he's like, what are these postcards? And the postcards all have people standing next to giant fruit. They've been like cut and pasted in a way to create these illusions of people standing next to like a giant watermelon or something.
Yep.
And we know from the first chapter that this will be important, or especially on a reread, you know that he's going to, for some reason, become fixated on these postcards. He says this weird thing to the shopkeeper where he's like, do you ever get the feeling your every move is being scrutinized? And the shopkeeper's like, what's the matter with you? He leaves his sample case, and then he walks out into this miniature golf course, and then that's the end of the chapter. And we don't know what happened at that point. Until later. Okay, was there anything I missed in there that we should cover?
No. I'm gonna say no, because I don't know that I would even go into that much detail in that chapter, but it's a very important introduction to Simon for sure.
Yeah.
And I think it's such a beautiful, as I said, for me that was the big impact of starting reading this book the first time was chapter 1, chapter 2 is just like, what a beautiful introduction to these two brothers.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
I'll tell you another thing.
Sets up a lot of stuff that comes back later.
Yes, and another thing that hit me about it was at the very end of the book, when you get the afterword by Seth, he says that Clyde Fans was a real shop, and he looked in the storefront one day, and he saw these pictures of these two men, and he imagined the fantasy. In his mind, he imagined what their lives must have been. And he created these characters just based on the photos of these two men he saw on the wall of this closed-up fan shop that had been closed for decades.
Yeah.
And I thought that's something I do, too. And that was another reason, like, the first time through, I was like, what's going on here? But then I was like, I absolutely, when I see some old thing or some photo of someone, I'm like, what was their life like? Now, I don't construct a 500-page graphic novel out of it, but absolutely wonder about those kind of things. And I totally got the impulse. Especially this, and I really understood Simon in this chapter, because trying to, sell, just the idea of it destroys my soul just thinking about it. And if I ever the idea of me trying to attempt it, I can't believe it. I was kind of amazed that Simon felt that he had to go. We don't know quite what spurred him to make this decision to actually make this attempt. But it seems to be the last time. Well, we learn later that something happened in the miniature golf course, which he even forgets about, sort of. Uh, that kind of spurred him to. He's like, I'm not leaving the house anymore.
Yeah, and it's something. Isn't there something that comes up later in maybe the next chapter when he's living with his mother? He talks about the house, and I mean, we talked about how Abe kind of characterizes it as a prison almost for Simon. But and I forget the metaphor exactly, but Simon describes it as it is a shell.
Yes, a shell, which he's excreted himself.
But everything inside the shell is real.
Yes,
and I can put my hands on it, and I can understand things that are inside the shell. But when I go outside into so-called reality, everything is fuzzy and hard to get a grasp on. So I think there's so many, again, like so many different ways that you can interpret what he's talking about here. I mean, this could be a metaphor or a way of explaining a kind of dementia or mental illness, because we do see from Abe's perspective that Simon did withdraw. And we even see these points where there seems to be time loss, where Simon looks up at an empty light socket.
Oh, yeah. That is amazing.
And then Abe is yelling at him like, dude, are you listening to me? And Simon kind of turns around and is like, yeah, what? It's like, the doctor just left. And you're like, the doctor just left? Like, and then you realize that weeks maybe have passed.
No, it's been 2 hours.
So it was 2 hours. Okay.
This is
anyways disorienting.
He goes into a fantasy. Because part of this is his. We cut to 1966, right? He goes to the miniature golf course. And when he first arrived in the town of Dominion, he heard two ladies in a diner talking about how they went on vacation, they went to some place, and this woman found this kind of glade, and she says it's where time seemed to stand still, a sort of enchanted place, and that line haunts him. Then he stops, and that line comes back. He thinks about that line when he arrives at the miniature golf course.
More on Clyde Fans coming up. This podcast is part of the Deconstructing Comics Network, where we're grateful to our supporters on Patreon. Patrons get exclusive extra content. At $2 a month and up, hear Bat Bits, a Batman 66 exploration with my brother Paul. At $4 a month, you also get our new monthly show Silver Age Batman, where I discuss Batman comics from the 50s and 60s with either Paul, Patrick, Emmett, or Kumar, as well as our previous series on Jim Starlin's run on Captain Marvel and the first 50 issues of Amazing Spider-Man by Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, and John Romita. Check it out at patreon.com/deconcomics, and thanks for your support. You can hear the first 2 episodes of Silver Age Batman just by following our Patreon for free, including listening to our hilarious look at the story The Secret of Batman's Utility Belt from Detective Comics 185. Go to patreon.com/deconcomics and click Join for free. The law of equivalent exchange has finished. But Patrick and I want to keep doing chapter-by-chapter discussions of manga, so we've changed the podcast's name to Full Manga Alchemists, and we're beginning a new season discussing Hitoshi Iwaaki's Parasite, a science fiction horror series that began in 1989. Same podcast feed, new name. Find it wherever you listen to podcasts. That's Full Manga Alchemists.
Now, we cut to 1966. This is the 3rd chapter. We see a young man walking through the woods in rain gear. We don't know what that is, but then we get Simon waking up. So maybe it was a dream of himself when he was young. It does come back again later. We never know if it ever really happened or if it was a dream or what. There's a lot of talk about dreams, a lot of fantasies in here, and you're never sure which is which. But now he narrates his own life in the way Abe sort of did. He starts off, it's like really minutia, like the left leg steps on the floor, the right leg steps on the floor and enters the slipper. He goes through how he knows how boring his life is and how routine it's become and how there's no meaning in it.
But also importantly, I think these are not speech bubbles.
That's
these
right.
are caption
That's
bubble,
right,
not
yes.
bubbles, but whatever. Yeah, like their narrative.
Yeah, but
box.
we know back in '66 he was keeping a diary, and he actually like read poetry. Like he brought a poetry book with him, which he thought was ridiculous. In a sense, he's always undercutting himself. Like he's like he thinks to himself during that chapter, what kind of an idiot brings a book of poetry on a sales trip? And here he's constantly like, what am I doing? What is the point of this? But as a reader, again, I was kind of imbuing meaning into things and value and worth.
Yeah.
Into his life, and he's going around. He can't. This is a chapter where he has trouble speaking to Abe, but actually his thoughts are very, as I said, very well thought out. Like he's been philosophizing for 10, 12 years at this stage, 20 years.
Yeah.
That was 57, so it's been 10 years.
Yeah.
His thoughts are much deeper, way deeper than anything we got from Abe in the first chapter. But anyway, at this point, he talks to his mother, and his mother is saying things like, I couldn't sleep last night because the people who come out of the light socket wouldn't stop talking.
Yeah.
And he's like, what are you talking about, mother? There aren't people who come out of the light socket. But then he goes into a room, and there are toys on the shelves that are speaking to him. And Seth has handled this by drawing word balloons coming from the toys, but there's no words in them. They're just empty. But he's speaking out loud. And then when he leaves that room, he says he had an owl up in the attic, which used to speak to him as a child, and said, "Good morning, Simon," to him. And he says he's always that those things are always drawing me back upstairs. But when he steps out of the room, he says, "Was I talking to someone?" Like he can't remember. That he was speaking out loud to these toys a second ago. Yeah. But at the same time, he's also like angry at his mother for talking about the people who come out of the light socket.
Yep.
Right. So he doesn't recognize what she's going through. He doesn't recognize that he's also having some issues.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, he's reliving as he says, every comment, every glance, every single thing that happened in his life in the outside world. He talks about how his memories and time are like a treasure box, and he says how embarrassingly stupid. Again, that's a thing where he's constantly undercutting himself.
Yeah.
He has these this vision. So Abe shows up at the house, and he talks to Mom. He realizes that Mom can barely hold it together. Now she didn't seem quite that extreme at the start of the chapter, but Abe's like, she can barely tell what's going on. The room smells like piss. She's peed herself. So this is another thing that Simon has not cottoned onto, doesn't realize is happening, is in denial about. And he's like, I'm going to get the doctor. We pack her things. We're going to move her into a home. Yeah. And Simon's like, okay. And that's when he looks in the light socket, and he has this extended fantasy.
Yeah.
And that's when Abe comes back and he says, that was 2 hours ago. Like, what are you doing? Yeah. But he keeps mentioning in this chapter that he had some epiphany, which he'd forgotten. Like, he kind of like, almost forgot. He's like, why did I decide to live in this house for her? He's like, it was that epiphany that I had. And, it only lasted, he said this epiphany lasted for 2 years, long enough to cement me in here for good. And he talks about how there was a sense of contentment, but that's been replaced by emptiness. He talks about a fantasy ad where there was a car. Well, he doesn't describe it as a fantasy. He said he saw a car outside his office, and he was like, something about it scared me, so I went into a crack in the wall. I folded myself into his room. And he doesn't describe it as a fantasy. He said, this really happened. I know it sounds strange, but I really went into that crack in the wall.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we have this, again, we flash back to the child in the raincoat exploring with his mother. And they go into these backyards of people's backyards that are full of garbage. And he finds a shell. But again, so now we know that the child in the raincoat was Simon. But we don't know if this is a dream or something that really happened with his mother. Yeah. But we do learn at this stage that he's not a complete shut-in because he used to go to a bookshop, or at least last time was 6 months ago. And then on his last visit 6 months ago, the shopkeep started talking to him and then kind of said something about how lonely he was or something like that, and he ran out of there, and he never
Ruined it.
I don't know if he ruined it, and I don't know if Simon ever left the house again after that.
Yeah.
So he takes his mom to a home, as we mentioned. At the home, Mom seems kind of okay. Like, she's not as doesn't seem as out of it as Abe is describing. Obviously, can't live at home with Simon, who can't tell what's going on either.
Yeah.
And this is when he comes back, and this is when we get the inventory of the toys and things.
Yeah.
And again, first time I read this, I was like annoyed by these 5 pages. And then the second time I looked around my office at all the toys that are here, and I was like, Jesus Christ, like, somebody's going to come through here.
Yeah.
At some stage when I'm gone, and they're going to be like, why does he own this? I have this Clyde Fans stamp. Somebody's going to come through here, and they'll be like, why does he own this piece of junk? Why is it in here? And they're going to be like, I don't know why he has these things, and it's just going to be like weirdness. And I was like, I totally got it. The second time through, I was like, I have all these things, and a lot of them are not valuable. They're just, oh yeah, I had that thing when I was 5, so I bought another one, you know?
Right.
And it's like, anybody walking in here is going like, this is a 5-cent piece of junk, why is it here, etc., etc. So I started to understand it. Like, the more I read this book, the more I dissolved into it.
Yeah. It's like an impressionist experience.
Yeah.
Right? That you can examine everything closely for meaning and try to find the connections between the pages from the back to the front. But at the end of the day, the just the impressions that you gain from passing your eyes over all these pages, it communicates these characters, and it gives you an impression of their lives that's not necessarily a sensical one or a rational one, but it is an impression.
Yeah.
You have a sense of Simon. You have a sense of Abe.
Yes.
And his mother and their mother.
Yes, and they have lives. It's just that on the outside, if you looked at this person's photo through a shop window that had been closed for 20 years, you're like,
yeah.
What was that guy's life like? Probably useless. And in fact, Simon considers his own life to be adding up to nothing.
Yeah.
But I found that I was giving his life more meaning than he was himself. There's a moment where he's trying to think about what was the finest moment in my life. This is, again, where he's forgotten about the reverie he had. He's like, was it when I ordered that Orange Royale soda at Union Station? Was that my finest moment? And I was kind of like, if I look back on my life, I guess I could put together some moments, but in 100 years, are they going to mean anything? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I was like, is my life any more valuable than Simon's? He's a shut-in, and he's actually, as we learn at the very last chapter, he's actually discovered that there's, in that moment of reverie, he's like, there is meaning in emptiness or in solitude. There is meaning in that, and he's tried to create a life with meaning out of those things. So all this kind of stuff kind of out in the second reading more than the first. Where I was like identifying with it. I was like, oh yeah, I feel like I search my life for that kind of meaning as well. And like, oh, was my finest moment that soda I had at that station 30 years ago or something like that? Yeah. Okay, 1975. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about in, was that 66? Yeah. So we're
66, we're good. Yeah.
So there's another 9-year jump. It seems, is that consistent?
Kind of is, because it does kind of go 57, 66, 75.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so they do jump 9 years there. And I think, and 66, I think, is where we really start to see some of the cracks in the psyche.
Yeah.
Of Simon.
I wanted to ask you, so you did talk about the cruelty of Abe. So did you feel it was cruel for him to put her in the home, or what Why did
No,
Seth
I
specifically?
I think cruelty partly we're told that
Right.
Abe is unkind through some of Simon's lines. Particularly, I think it might be in this chapter that we're about to talk about. No. It's the last chapter when I think Abe and Simon have a real conversation.
Right.
And I think Simon comes right out and says, "You're an asshole, Abe.
Yes.
You're a bully."
Yeah, this is the
or
75
whatever.
chapter. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's part of that, but also just the way that Abe speaks to Simon,
Yes.
even in 66
Yeah.
and stuff. Like, he clearly doesn't understand what Simon's going through with his mother.
Yeah.
He is kind of the absent son. But he
Yes.
speaks to Simon as though, Simon has dropped the ball on taking
Yes.
care of their mothers. Like, what have you been doing? How did you let her get to this state? And,
Yeah.
Simon is never able to say, well, you've never come to visit, so how am I to blame
Yeah.
for letting her get, so that's, I guess, those little cues that I picked up on, that
Yeah.
if you had not seen Abe in chapter 1 as his own kind of person,
Yeah.
the way that he's presented in chapters 2, 3, 4, and even 5, although I think we do come around in chapter 5 to have more sympathy for Abe, but
Right.
But yeah, without chapter 1, Abe is just kind of an asshole and a bully.
Right.
So it was necessary.
Yes.
It was necessary to have that humanized, that sympathetic chapter for Abe.
Yeah. So in 75, this is, in a sense, the things that happen in the 75 chapter are pretty linear. But again, it's all out of order and there's memories and stuff like that. So it actually starts with somebody searching for somebody frantically through the streets and then crying, and we don't know what it means or what it is.
It's weird that opens up as 1975, and then...
That's right, it's not actually happening in 75.
That's not 1975, is it?
No.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we don't learn that until much later, but maybe it's, does it start with somebody waking up again? Was it a dream memory? I don't think it does.
No, I don't think so.
No.
Because we go right into the catalog.
Yes, a catalog of
the
fans.
Borealis catalog.
Yeah. We had a catalog of Clyde Fans. It's 20 panels on a page. Again,
yep.
It's a lot.
I mean, that's only like, one page, though, isn't it?
Yes, it's only 1 page. It's not 5 pages. Yep. But now we get in this chapter, there are a lot of photographs. It's interspersed with photographs of just people, but there's always one person whose face is chopped out.
Yes, that too, yeah.
And now we get the scene of, this is the company finally being shutting down for good. Yep. At least so they had a manufacturing wing, which is Borealis. That factory is being shut down. So the sales, whatever inventory remains, is going to be kept and sold. So it's basically Abe talking to his lawyer about the final closing and how the workers are on strike, but they're just going to lose their jobs because he's shutting down the business completely.
Yep.
Now we get Abe remembering an argument with his mother and father, and he can't remember what his father looked like. Mm-hmm. Now, interestingly, in this chapter, Abe is reciting sales surveys out loud. Or no, he's in his head.
Questionnaires,
that salesmen should take for themselves. Like, do you always close the deal? Are you always friendly? This kind of thing. Rate yourself ABC. And he goes through every question and rates them. Later on, he actually accidentally speaks one of these out loud in Simon's presence. So we know he's got these kind of loops that are going in his head as much as Simon did, or maybe his mother. But we also learn that he had this... I love this chapter a lot, actually. He had an affair on the road with this woman named Alice, and he's constantly thinking about her face, but it's kind of hazy around the edges. This is really... It's really great how this plays out. And it's really like how you remember somebody that you knew 30 years ago, especially if it was like some kind of romantic interest. Yeah. And you have this kind of crystallized vision, but then you meet them again, and it's like, oh, that was all just a thing that had formed in memory.
That was my perspective on things.
Not even my perspective. My 20-year
right.
memory that you'd assembled.
Recreated.
Yes, exactly. Complete recreation.
Reassembled reality by my brain. Yeah.
Yeah. This is when he's dealing with his ex-wife Vera. So they had been married for 15 years, we learn at this stage. And he can't stand her. She can't stand him. He's sleeping in the attic of the house because he can't stand being anywhere in the house that she was. This is, again, behavior that, to me, seems as extreme as Simon's is. At this stage, he's already... Simon has become non-communicative with Abe. He hardly speaks to Abe. He just sits in a chair. We learn that Simon has been drinking. This is the only mention we get of this at any stage. Abe accuses Simon of getting fat, which is rich, coming from him. And we hear that Simon says it never felt real out there. And Abe mentions you came back with this weird euphoric grin on your face.
Yeah.
And we get this is interesting because we get a full page splash of the grin on his face, which is a weird look. We've never seen anything like this from Simon. But it contrasts with an earlier full page splash of Abe's face where he looks really grim. And he's Abe is accusing Simon of being weird that day when he came back. And it's really like, is that any worse than the look we get, this full page we get from Abe? To me, it's interesting the way Seth does this kind of, these visual motifs that come back, and he knows exactly what he's doing with this kind of stuff. And again, it's something you don't really necessarily notice the first time through. But it's like, it's like he's really accusing him of being a loser, effectively. It's a long argument they have. And he's no better. And this is right after he's fired all those people at the factory, as well.
Yeah.
We hear about the mom's funeral at this stage where nobody showed up. It was Abe, Simon, and like the priest and maybe another person, but there were no...
The nurse or something.
Absolutely,
but not even the doctor.
Right.
Not even the doctor was there. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. We also hear that there was some woman named Emily. Actually, Simon had been trying to write a book about these postcards. And then somebody beat him to the punch and put out a book before him, and that really seemed to ruin his life. Like, he had one thing he was holding on to. Because he started collecting these postcards, and he was corresponding by mail with people. And there was some woman named Emily, and Abe says, whatever happened to that girl Emily used to write to? And Simon says, I asked her to stop writing me. And... It's such a bombshell of a line, because we're like, wait a second. It sounds like Emily might have had some romantic interest in Simon by mail, and he's like, I had to ask her to stop writing me, and we get a thought panel from a caption from Abe thinking, I'm not even going to go there. Like, I can't ask about that. But earlier in the previous chapter, when Simon was walking around the house by himself, we do get a thought where he thinks, he's got all these deep thoughts about the movement of time and how every instant you're a new person. And he thinks about how he would stop in front of a shop and try to freeze himself in time and then walk to the next shop window and then think about the self that was back there. And he thinks how everyone has moved on in time, and he's frozen himself in the house. And he thinks about Emily, and he wonders where she is, but he says, that's not the Emily I want, because that Emily is back there in the past, and this is a different Emily. So maybe it's just even mentally he was like, this is a different person. I don't know, but it was fascinating to me that Seth only gave us one line about that whole quote-unquote relationship.
Yeah. And yet this chapter is all, it's such a about face in the book in that we finally have a connection between Simon and Abe.
Yeah.
And not that things are answered, but this is kind of like the chapter where we get the answers.
Yes.
Not that we really get the answers, but there is a sense of connection. There's a reconciliation between the kind of Abe that we see in chapter 1 compared to the Abe that we see in chapters 2 and 3. Well, no, that does come in this chapter, because we see when Abe goes back to that woman he had the affair
Alice,
with.
Yeah.
Alice, that he actually, like, when he learns that he had completely forgotten how huge of an asshole he was to her.
Yeah.
Like, he kind of takes it well, and it for me, that actually kind of rehumanized him. It's like he admitted to himself how much of
he knows
an asshole he was, right? Like, he was like, yeah, you know what, I was an asshole.
Yeah, but in some ways he doesn't know. It's really interesting because this line comes up again and again, which is something their father used to say, which was about how names are important. Simon says, names are important, because as soon as you hear a name of someone that you knew, it calls up all these associations, etc., things like that. Now, so Abe calls up Alice. He's trying to rekindle this thing because he's just broken up with his wife. He's miserable about that. And he's like, okay, he calls her up. He's like, let's meet at this hotel in this town. And he drives out there, and he says, he remembers his old sales route like he remembers his own name. And he knows the name of every single town that he stopped at. He lists them off in order. He knows them so well. And then he's like, oh, I had those affairs with all those women on the road. And he's like, I can't remember any of their names. Right? So he remembers the names of all the towns. He knows exactly what his route was, but he can't remember the names of anyone that he slept with on the road except for Alice, which he's constructed this whole fantasy about. He doesn't even remember how they broke up. He's in his mind, it was like they were still going and just kind of faded away, I guess. But he does reveal at this stage that he kept Clyde Fans open. He admits himself that he kept it open because he was hoping his dad would have a place to come back to. We learned that Dad had just walked out on them.
Yes, yeah.
So it's half and half. Like, he's aware of that side of himself. He's aware of that he's an asshole, but he's not aware of the irony that he can remember all the towns, but he can't remember the names of the women. Like, he's half there. He's unaware of Simon's life or Simon's mental health problems. He just seems to think that Simon's just being a jerk because of his personality. There's an interesting scene here where he accidentally spills all of Simon's postcards on the ground, and Simon says, don't worry about it, it's just old paper. Again, anytime anyone mentioned paper, my mind started going like, wait, this means something. Maybe it doesn't. He hooks up with Alice, or he tries to hook up with Alice again. He meets her at the hotel, and she's like, I got married twice. And then she's like, I can't believe you called me after the way it ended. And he's like, what are you talking about? And he's like, she's like, we're even in the same hotel. He didn't even realize that. He like booked the same hotel where he had split up with her. Yeah. And then that's when he has a realization. He's like, it's all illusion out here. I need to get back home. Yes. And then his car breaks down. He has a flat tire, and that's the end of that chapter. And based on what we know from the rest of the book, the next time we see him is in 1997. And he's been living in that house for 20 years, where he hadn't lived before. And he, too, had realized after this business with Alice that it's illusion out here, the real world. He finally understands Simon. He says, the real world is back in the house. I need to get back there.
Yeah. It's a pretty incredible history. I mean, it's a big book, but I don't know. It doesn't seem big enough to contain all of the things that we've talked about over the last hour. If it's even, it's been close to an hour. So, an incredibly dense.
And this is where we learned that it was him chasing his father was what we had seen in that opening sequence.
Beginning of the chapter.
He has a memory of he was chasing his father. His father left the family. He decided to go try to find him. He went to all his old haunts. And then couldn't find him, stopped in a park and was crying. And we get a little icon teardrop. Often Seth uses these little icons of stars or moons. And they don't look like cartoons. They look like symbols, like on a keyboard or something, of a star or a moon or something like that. Yeah, so that's kind of the last we hear of him.
Yep.
Yes, but I'm wondering how humanized he was, as you said. He's kind of he's half there. He knows he's a jerk, especially after the business with Alice.
I mean, in a way, it's kind of this slice of life comic that these guys, Chester and Seth and Joe Matt, they were all doing, and not just them, but those three guys, because they were hanging out together as well. But like, these people are people, and there's nothing kind of neat or clean or explicable about them. All these messy things are who they are. And yeah, I mean, you could have given us Abe's chapter at the end of this book. And I mean, can you imagine how Abe would have come across without having seen him in chapter 1? I mean, not that he was a shining paragon of human virtue or anything, but just he was just an old guy going about his day, kind of talking to us. Or apparently, possibly talking to us. Like, that really humanized him. But without that, he just would have been the asshole brother. Yes. Whereas when I was reading all those asshole brother scenes, I was like, wow, this poor guy's having a really bad day. He's being really unkind to his brother. Rather than, like I don't know. It's like seeing somebody cut in front of line at the cafe versus seeing somebody that cut in front of line at the cafe. Right. Yeah. So yeah. So I don't know if that makes any sense to any of our listeners, but
yeah. So we flash back to 1957. We're back on the mini golf course, and now we see the epiphany that happened to Simon. His mind kind of leaves his body. Floats across these fields. Goes into these old empty sheds, empty farmhouses and barns. This is a thing as well that really hit me, because I think when I'm driving on the road, especially through the countryside, I fantasize about walking across every field, and especially like seeing the rundown sheds and stuff like that, and wondering what was going on there and wanting to go in there. And I thought it was crazy. And then I had a conversation with my younger brother once when we were driving in the country, and he was like, I fantasize about walking across those fields and going in those houses. And I was like, holy shit, yes. And I totally got it when his mind was... and he seems to know what the lives of all these people were. Like, he knows who lived in the farmhouse, the husband and wife. He knows when they died. And he says in his captions, I don't know how I'm privy to this information. I've just been granted it. I don't know where it's coming from. But I have this information. It's all done in a really, like... the book goes almost completely black. Very like black. A very dark blue or purple or gray kind of. For any other color that's not the nighttime, the night sky. The moon has just become a perfect circle, just an icon in the sky. There's a scene where he comes across some factories, and it's just drawn so beautifully. And the factory, the lights in the windows are another thing that I fantasize about all the time. When I see lights in like office buildings at night, where it's just like a few of them that are on, I'm like, whoa, like somebody's in there. What's their job? What's their life? It's not like a long reverie about these things, but I just cannot stop wondering whenever I see that kind of image. And he's captured that here. He's also done a very clever thing where he talks about around the factory there is corroded pipes and all this junk and dust. He doesn't draw those things. I don't think Seth can draw those things. He's very clever about just drawing the icons of the factory and just giving us a caption, and we know exactly what he means. We can very easily visualize it. he comes across a diner and he like understands the lives of all the people there and who took over and who quit and all this kind of stuff. And he finally comes into this big, empty, like almost like a castle, like this giant mansion. There's several of these around Ontario. It's like the Addams Family house almost. And it's empty. It's kind of in ruins.
Yep.
But he realizes, he thinks to himself, I've been given a lesson tonight. This night is a lesson about the beauty and solemnity that comes with solitude, estrangement, and decay. And he realizes that his purpose in life is to find that solemnity and solitude and estrangement and decay by just being in his house, like as if there's meaning in that. Now, you could read this as actually unhealthy mentally.
Yeah.
But Seth is presented in a way where I sympathized completely. Like, I understood that his mind had reached this point, maybe because he had gone on a journey that I go through whenever I look at those fields and farmhouses and things like that. And I was like, okay, I understand that he will find meaning here just living at home with mother. He takes the train home in the real world. He wakes up, he takes the train home. But he has a fantasy or dream of his mother again, telling him to draw. By the way, he likes sketching. Besides reading poetry, he actually draws in notebooks. It's the thing he does. He doodles kind of in his spare time. Yeah. And we learned that that's what those pages were at the beginning of the book that we didn't understand before we got to the title page.
Oh,
were his drawings.
Right. Yeah.
So he had a kind of artistic inner life going on. And his mother, in this dream, his mother's eyes looked very weird. Like, you get the star, which turns into a moon image, like a white circle, which elongates into this oval, and then it morphs into this eye. It's a very weird sequence. It starts with a window that turns into the star, and then his mom is giving him this kind of nursery rhyme about if all the world were paper and all the sea was ink and all the trees were bread and cheese, what would we have to drink? And I stared at this for a very long time, again, trying to assemble the meaning out of it. He dreams about, like, is this the point where he dreams about meeting, or was that last chapter where he dreamed about meeting her? That was last chapter. Anyway, her eyes turn into these weird kind of almost sinister cat's eyes in a full page. He goes home, maybe for the last time. Abe says, "Simon, is that you?" And then we get a repeat of the euphoric grin on his face.
Right, where he has arrived.
He has arrived. Home. It's the only time we see him smile, and he says, "Yes, Abe, it is." We didn't have the balloons last time. We didn't know what he was saying. Maybe because Abe didn't remember it. And that's the end. Literally, we get a page that says "the end."
Yeah.
And we had a few portraits of the brothers.
Are they both Simon, though?
Oh, you're right.
I think they're both Simon. One's young and one's old.
Oh, yes.
Did we get Abe at the beginning or something, maybe?
That's a good
anyway,
question.
I don't know exactly if there's that kind of symmetry to the book, but...
Yeah, there is,
it is Abe at the beginning, young and then old.
Young and old.
And
yes. And it made me wonder, again, it's like anytime I drive around or look around, or I would drive through a suburb and I see all those houses, I think there's 5 people living in every house, and there's all these teeming lives everywhere, and every photo of a person or groups of people, those are all lives that were... Yeah. I started thinking all these very deep thoughts out of a book which, in a sense, started out, seemed to be very simple. Seemed straightforward at the beginning, and then, I mean, even the cartooning became very complex with the repeated visual motifs and things like that, and the things being put in out of order. But it's on the surface level of the plot, there's nothing really is going on, but I went very deep into it, and I think placing that Reverie chapter at the very end was genius, because you're forced to go through it with Simon and understand his mind in that period completely. And it really puts you in the mind of another person. And even that the very first chapter where he's just narrating his day is like, that's what life has got to be like for myself and other people.
Yeah.
There's an internal monologue of some sort probably going on. It might be the same one that you go through every day. I mean, all this kind of stuff really hit me strangely. Maybe, and again, as I've said again and again, more so on the second reading.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely a book that it contains much more than it possibly could.
Yeah.
Like, I think there's also a lot of history here that we haven't talked about at all.
Yes.
And in fact, I think it might be one of the quotes from the back, or maybe it was somewhere else that I saw it. But I did not interpret the book this way, but I thought it was a lovely way to describe the book, and it was something along the lines of, this is a history of kind of I can't remember how they worded it, but something like a history of 20th century Canadian small business, whatever, dressed up as a day in the life kind of.
That's true.
Whatever. Memorial. What's the
memoir?
Whatever.
Memoir.
Thank you. Yes, that's the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
So the book is that also, and we haven't talked about that. How, like, the inventories, not just of his mother's room, but the catalog inventory. Even when he's going through those ruined mansions in Northern Ontario or whatever, there's something very inventory about about the way that they go through the rooms. It's sort of, it echoes the inventory of his mother's room and the catalog of the Clyde Fans manufacturing catalog or whatever. But so there's all that other stuff that's also in this book.
A real attention to architecture, which is part of that. You get architecture in 57 versus 1997. When we get the city views, which is and the factories, all that was part of that. That's all in there too.
And the stories of the story of a family that's dealing with different forms of mental conditions, whether they're decaying or changing or however you want to describe it. And you sort of see how that the way that Abe and the rest of his family responded to that was probably fairly typical of the time, in that there wasn't necessarily a lot of sympathy or empathy or even patience for people who were, quote unquote, losing their minds or whatever. So the book is functioning on that aspect as well, and that kind of there's the melancholy decay of independent business. There's other things that are touched on in the socio-economic sense as well.
I also love that as I talked about at the very beginning, people have this idea of Seth that he's obsessed with the olden days. But I think this book is like the opposite of that. It's like a realization that these objects only have meaning to the person that owns them, that things weren't necessarily better back then. It's like an awareness. He's not like an idiot about it. He's not just strangely obsessed.
And I think he talks about it a little bit in the documentary that you sent me a link to, which I think is probably a decent thing to mention here as well. I'm not sure how available it is around the world. I know we've probably got listeners on every continent. No, I don't know. But anyway, it's a Canadian Film Board production called Seth's Dominion, which, at least here in Canada, it's available for free on YouTube. And it's a 40-minute film. I don't remember the director's name. It was Luke something.
Okay.
But anyway, you had sent me the link to it, and I think it might even be referred to in the back of this book. But it's called Seth's
Luke Chamberlain.
Dominion. Yeah. Luke Chamberlain.
Yeah.
So yeah, a 40-minute documentary, and Seth kind of he mentions, I guess there's one or two lines that in that documentary where he mentions that a lot of his attraction to the old timey stuff it's the aesthetic.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily.
Yes.
Yeah, and
the
I think
mores or something. Yeah.
He's aware of it.
Yeah.
He knows what he's looking at. He's not an idiot, but he likes that aesthetic.
Yeah.
He likes the trench coat and the hat and
the vest.
Probably the pipe, the vest. Yes, the smoking, the cigarettes, even if it's not a pipe. But yeah. But that's all there. But so on, and so many other things as well in this book.
Yeah. And then you go back to the beginning, and it's those pages of the empty house, and we're going through the house of those people that are gone, like Simon went through the farmhouse of those people that were gone, and it's kind of a realization that those people disappeared from the world as well, and they're just photos on the wall of an empty shop front. Yeah.
Right. In the same way that Seth looked in a window and saw two photos that gave birth to this story about Abe and Simon Matchcard. Simon was, the characters in this book kind of have a similar experience there as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, however this book performs in the Canada Reads competition this year.
Yeah, I was going to ask if it had been eliminated.
I have no idea. Okay. I don't really follow it, but there's no surprise to. I mean, reading this book, it's clearly it belongs in the competition, even if it doesn't come out on top.
Yes.
But I certainly wouldn't be surprised if it did.
But I would also say I don't think it's for everybody.
It's not for everybody.
It's you need some
not an
patience.
Easy
no, not easy to read. In that sense,
but there was something I watched recently that made me think of this book, and I don't remember what it was. It doesn't even really matter, but I was watching something, and you know what? I think it was a music video.
Okay.
And the music video had these very very serene kind of shots. And in fact, the overall video is kind of a melancholy, pastoral kind of feel to it. Similar in tone to what I think Clyde Fans has for a lot of it. But I found myself watching this music video, and as the editor and or director kept cutting to another scene, I found myself lamenting and railing against the editing. Say, why are you cutting away from that? Why don't you let me sit on that composition? Like, you've got the costume, you've got the lighting, you've got the music, you've got the shot. Now, why do you have to cut away from it after 4 seconds or whatever it is, And I mean, obviously, there's other reasons. Maybe it's only a 3-minute song. You can't spend 45 seconds on a shot, because then your music video would only be 5 shots. Clyde Fans never cuts away too soon. Those inventory pages, those walks that Simon takes, the sequences. I mean, even chapter 1, all of chapter 1, it's like an entire day. We see the guy get up out of bed, make his breakfast. We see him make his lunch. We see him make his dinner. We see him take a bath. We see him get back in bed. It's the whole damn day, over 100 pages. And like you say, very little happens, but there's so much going on. It's really and in the same way that there's film or there's books, you will watch those, not necessarily music videos, but you'll see those bits of
Yeah. All right.
Throughout.
Let's let that be the last word.
Let's.
Clyde Fans by Seth is published by Drawn and Quarterly. By the way, to Dana's guess that we have listeners on all continents. No evidence of Antarctic listeners, but yes, there have been at least a few downloads of our show on the other 6 continents. But of course, largely in English-speaking countries. If you're listening at McMurdo or another Antarctic research station, please drop us a line. We'd love to hear from you. And we hope to hear from the rest of you as well. At deconstructingcomics.com, you can connect to us on X, Facebook, YouTube, and Blue Sky, and find links to subscribe to the podcast. You can comment on any episode on our site, drop us a line at mail@deconstructingcomics.com, or talk to us. Click the Leave a Voicemail link on the left sidebar of our site. Are you making a comic? Send it to us and we'll do a Critiquing Comics episode about it. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. The music backing the promotion of our Patreon is Change by Jazar. Next week, more Jack Kirby Captain America discussion. Emmett and I look back at Captain America and the Falcon issues 206 to 208, in which our heroes meet the Swine. Not a literal pig, but a horrible Central American dictator type. And then the story suddenly veers into a monster tale. We'll look at all that next week. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.